This video is a continuation of the series of videos on Heroku architecture credential by example. The rest of the videos are available through a Medium article of the same title. The previous video we did was on Redis, and we wrote an example app for how to use Redis. We're going to do the same thing here, but this time with Kafka. Now, I've actually never used Kafka, and I'll talk a little bit about what alternatives are. But it's basically, we're going to go through what it is, we're going to do a local example, we're going to look at an example on Kafka, and then, or spin it up on how to interact with Kafka on Heroku, and then we'll write a simple example. And along the way, we'll set up a worker dyno and talk about worker dynos a little bit. Let's go first talk about what Kafka is. So Kafka Introduction. So they describe it as a distributed streaming platform. What we're going to do is, and then to be honest, you could read a lot about it and still not get a good sense of it. I think this diagram is probably your best way of understanding it, other than the example we're going to do. We're going to actually write a concrete example, and you'll kind of see what it's doing. So the idea here is there are, you're running a very complex system of applications, right? And you have some systems that generate data, and you call those producers. And historically, you also have applications on the other end of the spectrum that need to consume data. Maybe they need to, one system generates data, another system needs to consume it. And one way of handling all this is to have the producers and consumers communicate directly, right? They have APIs, they talk amongst themselves, and the problem is you get this sort of mishmash of connections between producers and consumers. So another model is, and this is where Kafka comes in, is you have all the producers now, instead of talking directly to consumers, they talk to a middleman, the Kafka system, which basically collects all the data that's being pumped out by the producers and then keeps a hold of it. And then as consumers can connect to it, more than one in particular, and they can then listen for changes and consume the data. So that's basically at the core what it's about. There's a lot of flexibility in constructing how you group your consumers and producers. And we're going to keep it super simple in our example and not get too complicated, because we're just going to try to just get the main concepts here. Okay, so that's it for that. And now just, I guess as a comparison, is there other ways of doing things like this? The most common one, at least the ones I've used, is Rabbitmq. So it has a somewhat of the same concept. It's basically a message broker that acts between two different systems, right? It has a different data model, and it's if I was doing something on a smaller scale and I needed, for example, a web service to then maybe kick off work for a worker service, I definitely would use Rabbit or some traditional message queue and not Kafka. Kafka is going to be more, I think the main differentiator is Kafka is more geared towards a producer and then many different consumers of consuming that data. That's one thing that Rabbit doesn't really do. You don't have a concept of many consumers. You have one consumer consuming a message at a time. Okay, let's just get right to the example. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is create a local environment so we can kind of learn about it locally first. Part of the deal here is normally I'd be working on the master branch, but because now this Kafka is not cheap on Heroku, the default it's like $1,500 a month, right? There is lower plans, so if you're not careful, you'll find yourself in a $1,500 plan. There's a basic zero that's only $100 a month, so that's what we're going to use here. But even then, I don't want to leave it up and running, so I'm going to do my work in a separate branch than master, because I don't want to carry this code forward into like the future work. So it'll live only in the Kafka branch. Okay, the first step is make sure, yeah, this is clean. This is basically where we're at from last time with Redis. So I'm going to copy in a file, desktop. Okay, and I'm going to look at what's changed in this Docker Compose file. Okay, so before we just had Postgres and Redis, right? Now we're going to add in some extra services to allow for Kafka locally. Zookeeper is a data store that Kafka uses under the hood, so we need it. I'm not exactly sure why we need to expose it on a public port, but that was in the standard config. Kafka, on the other hand, is exposed on port 9092, and it is indeed something we will directly interact with in our code. And there's some configuration here that's not obvious. Like obviously one is you need to tell it where to find Zookeeper at. That makes sense. This advertised host name, it's not entirely sure why I need to tell it, but it's required. And it's not entirely sure why I need to map a local file, this Docker sock file, to the within the container. But I just copied the kind of the hello world example from this this provider of the Docker image. Okay, so to get running with this, all you do is you run Docker compose. Now I'm going to need to use up because I'm bringing up new services. And if you're doing this for the first time, this will take about 30 minutes or so, depending on your internet connection, because it has to download a lot of containers. But I've already done this earlier, so this only takes a few minutes if it's already up and running. Okay, so I'm going to kill it, and I'm going to do Docker compose start now, and Docker PS. Okay, so I am up and running with Docker with Kafka on my local machine. So we'll do a couple things to interact with it first here. I'm going to pause for a second. Just give me a second here. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so one of the things we need to do before we kind of work with, just like kind of like how we had to seed the database under Postgres, we'll need to do some setup work for Kafka before we start using it. And the way we need to do this is I'm going to go to the documentation on Kafka. There's a quick start for Kafka. That's what we're on right now. And there's a couple commands. So we've already got our server running. So we're on to this create a topic. And what I'm going to do is we're going to have to run this command here. But the question is, how do you run, I don't have Kafka on my machine. So how do I run this command? And so there's a trick with Docker, how to do this. So we'll talk about the command when we get to the point where we can type it. So Kafka is running on right here. It's basically, this is the name right here, this ID basically. So what I can do is I can remote connect into that Docker container, and then I can maybe use commands on it to then interact with Kafka itself. So the command for doing this in Docker is you say docker exec minus interactive terminal, then you paste in the name of the container, and then you run bash. Docker PS. Well, my Docker container. Okay, why did my Docker container go down? Okay, let's just do Docker stop. Docker compose stop. Let's bring it back up. Go ahead. Docker compose start. I don't remember stopping it. Okay, Docker PS. Okay. I don't know why it, well, whatever. Okay. Okay, so I'm on basically the Docker container itself, right? And there's a folder called opt Kafka. And there's a bin folder here. Okay. And if you look here, these commands here are all the ones that are described in this documentation, like Kafka topics is probably right here. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste this command in. So I'm going to go, and then we'll kind of walk through the command as we go because it's kind of long. Slash. Okay. So let's walk through what this command is. So this is Kafka is broken down into. So I'm trying to think of an analogy. So the idea here is a topic is, think of it as a particular stream of data that you might want to send data to, like an ordered list of messages, right? And a Kafka server can have more than one topic. Okay, and then the key here is that when a publisher, producer publishes something, he publishes it to a topic, and likewise a client, when they're listening to the consumer, is listening to data, they subscribe to a topic. So in this case, I'm creating a new topic. I'm going to basically use the server that it's going to use to create it on is the local host, which is the Docker container itself. I'm not doing any data replication. It's just a single, basically single broker, right? And partitions, it's basically an advanced topic of a way that you can split apart a topic, so you can have different consumers consuming different parts of your tree. Don't want to get into that. Just think of it as just a single partition, but then you do supply a name for the topic, and I'm going to call it test. Okay, so I do that, and that basically will talk to. Okay, now if I want to see what topics exists, I can run the same command. See if I can. Right, there's a list command. In fact, I'm going to copy and paste this. So this is just inquiring to the Docker server what topics it has to export. So you can see that I have a singular topic. Okay. The next thing we need to do is kind of play around. And we're just going to just make sure this is behaving the way we want. They actually have a sample consumer that you can listen to. In fact, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to first use their sample producer. I'm going to spin it up to that will send information to the topic. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to paste this line in. Yeah. And I'm going to say 1. Okay. That just essentially sent the first message into the queue of messages for that topic, right? Now to see that it's doing something, I'm going to go up and open a new window. I'm going to pause the video again for a second. Give me a second. Okay, back. So right now I've got my producer running to produce data, right? Now I'm going to do, I'm going to grab and copy this again. Let's say Docker exec interactive terminal, the terminal bin bash. I'm going to go into the opt Kafka. I'm going to go to bin. I'm going to copy and paste this command. And we'll look at the command in a minute before we enter it. So what this is going to do is say, go to the server, and this consumer is going to subscribe to the topic, and it's going to start from the beginning of the message stream, right? So you can actually join in the conversation at any point in the stream, and they're basically indexed by number. Okay, so I hit enter, and what should happen is I should see 1 spit out on the screen here. There it is, because that was the one I put in earlier. Now what's more important here is I can actually now put in another message, 2, and you'll see it appear over in the consumer. right? So okay, so the idea is I've got a producer producing data, and I've got a consumer consuming data, and they're different systems. I mean, it's sort of hokey that this is all like example command line codes, but you know, essentially different processes that are producing and consuming. Okay, so I can get out of this. That's now working. So I've got my Kafka server kind of ready to go. Exit. Okay, Heroku cert. Okay, let me close this up. Okay, so the next question is, how do we start to think about writing our code locally, right? I'm going to do this by, let me get my head straight here. Yeah, so the way we typically do this is there's an environment file that we need to specify. So if I go into my files, I have an environment file. I think I already did this earlier, so that's why you'll see it. You need to, again, this URL format is the same thing that is used by Kafka and it's used by Kafka, but it's also used by Heroku, right? So I'm going to say Kafka URL, and then I'm going to give it the connection to the local hosts, right? This is the local machine on port 9092. Okay, so that's the first step. The next step is to, I think we're ready to look at the code real quick. So I'm going to do everything locally first, okay? Because this is complicated enough to not get confused with Heroku yet. The next step is to copy this code over. I've already written the code for how to use Kafka, so I'm going to do it that way. Trying to remember. Oh, okay. Source, copy tilde / desktop server. Okay, and there's actually another file, and we'll talk about this in a minute. Okay, so I copied two files over. One's called server, one's called worker. So let's look at what the server code changes are. So the server code, and I think I need to also install, there's a node library called no Kafka, so I need to actually install that too before I continue. So let me do that real quick. npm install no Kafka. I'll let that install for a second. Now they actually have a bug in there. I think if I run npm audit, I just noticed this, but I'm not going to try to fix it here in this demo. They actually have a dependency on an old version of Lodash, which has a security hole in it, but I'm not going to worry about it for now. That's a different problem. So now let's look at the different what the code looks like. So the new code's on the right. Okay, and again, I'm going to avoid typing it. It's going to be in the repo. You can find it there. There's not that much code that we add, right? Just a couple lines here. So the first thing we need, we're going to create it so that our web service is a producer, right? So you're going to hit an endpoint, it's going to generate a message. Pretty simple, okay? In this case, oops, didn't mean to click on that. We're going to import producer from no Kafka, okay? And then what's new? We're going to have a Kafka setup. So here we specify the topic. That's the topic we created earlier, right? Partition, we only have a single partition, so it's partition 0. We're going to get the URL from the environment variables, right? Again, like before, if an environment variable is not defined, we're going to hard fail, okay? And we create a new producer right here. Okay, so then we have in our start loop. The first thing that you need to do is you need to kind of actually do the initialization. You notice that under the hood, just so you know, I didn't actually ever use this URL. That's because Kafka under the hood automatically uses that particular URL, coincidentally, for how it knows how to do its connection. So I don't have to specify a actual connection string here, although you can, but so we have to wait for it to connect, and then we just use it. So way down here, here you can see app get send. So I'm going to have a send endpoint, and what's going to happen here is I try to send a message to the topic, to the partition, right, and of a value, just sending a message of the called value hello, right, and then if that's successful, I just just say send true back to the client. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second again. I got a runny nose if you haven't figured that out. Okay, I'm back. Okay, so that's basically the entirety of this code, right? Nothing new here. So it's basically connect to Kafka, initialize it, and then whenever I hit the send endpoint, just send a message to Kafka saying hello. Okay, and then the other code is a worker. So if you remember, with Heroku, you can actually run more than one dyno with your application. You can only have one web dyno, but you can have as many other dynos as you want. So just as a big picture reminder of all the kind of dyno types that we've talked about so far, one is a web dyno, which is our server here. We used a released dyno that was specifically used for when we needed to do migrations, right? We used a one-off dyno where we just basically temporarily spin up a dyno. We use that for an example of using migrations in our staging and production environments. And now the fourth kind is kind of the catch-all, which is basically worker processes that can't take web traffic, but they can interact with the rest of the internet, right? They can make outbound calls. They're sitting there processing things. So let's look at the sample code here first, and then we'll integrate it into Heroku. So let's see if I can shrink this down. Okay, so again, I'm going to kind of skim through this code. It's all new, right? This time I'm actually spinning up something called using a simple consumer, okay? And then I have the same topic and partition, same environment variable, right? I create a new consumer, I have a start script, I initialize the consumer, and then I subscribe to that topic partition. And offset 0 means start at the 0, right? This is an ordered list of messages, so this thing always starts at 0. Now, in practice, you probably would keep track of where you last left off, but this one is always going to start at 0, right? And then you pass it a callback function, which is every time it gets basically a message, here, do something. And then all I'm doing is console logging. And interesting enough, it requires this function here is required to return a promise. So I'm just generating a true promise just to provide a promise. I'm not using that, but it was required. And then if there's an error, just fail out. That's basically it. So the next step is, in order for us to use this worker, you need to define in your proc file a new entry. So here again, it doesn't have to be called worker. It's basically if there's web, release, or reserved words, and any other word, it's got to be alphanumeric, and there were some restrictions on, you couldn't use double underscores or stuff like that. Basically, you can use any word here. It's basically going to be a worker no matter what you type here. In this case, I'm going to run node dist worker.js. Again, I just use worker to make it more clear what I'm doing. Okay, so what this means is I spin up my application. And there'll be a web dyno and a worker dyno. Okay, okay, that's it for that. Now we could actually test this if all works, which is, well, should work. Let's try it. If I do npm run watch, let's watch this come up. Okay, so I see, I see a couple things here. I can see my web came up, which is good. I can see my worker came up and it already connected to Kafka. And you notice that I had already put in 1, 2, 3, so it's already got 1, 2, 3 already in its, it's already output 1, 2, 3, which means it's connected and consuming information. So to test it, the full end-to-end flow here, if I bring up a browser, and bring up a browser to see the screen here. If I go to HTTP, localhost 5000, send, there it is, sent true, and then there's the hello in my worker picked up the hello. Okay, so that is Kafka working locally, right? Let's see what else we need to do. Right, so we had to just kind of recall what we did. We had to use the Docker Compose to, spin up a new Kafka container locally, right? We had to the package JSON, we had to install the dependency of no Kafka. We wrote our server code, we wrote a worker code, and then we added to the proc file, we added the entry to spin up the worker. Okay, that's it for local development. Now let's talk about provisioning this on, like in on Heroku. So I'm going to do this the GUI way, and I'm not going to worry about review apps right now at all. In fact, I don't even know if Kafka will work in a review app. Kafka tends to be pretty heavy and expensive. I'm just trying to get I'm not sure if I can even get it to run as a review app, but that's something you can do on your own. I don't want to get too deep into Kafka, to be honest, just because there's a lot of other topics to cover in videos. Heroku. Okay, so the first step here is, I've already did this earlier to make sure I can get this to work at some basic level. So I already added Kafka. Here it is right here. Now just to show you what happens if you're not careful, if I just say Kafka and I hit enter, you notice by default it defaults to a $1,500 a month service, which you probably don't want to do while you're learning. You can change it back to 100, and even that I don't want to keep around. But okay, so that's one thing. Okay, when it does that, it does a couple things that are interesting. If you look at the settings, okay, you've got all this extra stuff about certificates, right? All these Kafka. You got this prefix thing, whatever that is. You got this trusted cert, and then you get a URL which looks different. It has Kafka plus SSL, and to make matters even more confusing, it's actually got multiple comma-separated hosts. So this is actually a cluster of Kafka brokers. So this is a multi-broker system, right? So it's more robust than our single instance on our machine. Okay. Now, to be honest, I don't necessarily want to get bogged down in like rewriting my code to take advantage, to actually do the certs and all this. I'll show you where you can find it, right? And just sort of get a sense, okay, this is doable, but we're not going to actually do it, mostly because I don't really want to keep this code running. I don't want to keep Kafka running anyway in Heroku. But there are a couple things we need to do first before we even look at the code. Remember, I'm going to go here to Kafka, Heroku, Kafka. So there's a whole section on Heroku, on Kafka here, right? And one of the things that you need to do is you need to, remember we had to create our topics and that stuff, and they have command line tools for doing this, right? So the first thing, just so you know, is before you can, see if I can find it here. Let me get my command line tools up here. Okay, so there are Kafka commands for Heroku, but before you can use it, you have to actually basically, that's not what I wanted. Before you can use the command line tools, you have to add a plugin to the command line tools that enables the Kafka commands on the Heroku's command line tools. So I did that already. Apparently it's a lot harder if you're on Windows. But but if I'm on a Mac, so I didn't have to do anything. Okay, so and I've already provisioned it, but you can do this command right here, Kafka info. Let's do that and see. So I'm going to do Heroku Kafka info. And then I have to specify the app, right, which is Heroku cert Larkin Tucker, and then it's a stage. So that's going to give me information. Oh, I do mean that. Oh, it's Kafka. Okay, let me fix that. Kafka. Okay. Okay, so basically tells me I've got an instance, it's available, tells you the version of it. This topics, it has no topics currently, so that I can't really subscribe or publish to anything, right? And there's no partitions. Again, that's right now we're using a single partition locally anyway, and we've got no data there, right? So that's fine. Now, before, the way we created topics, we had to like shell into the environment and do a bunch of those commands. There's actually commands here that we can actually run from here. So I can go, for example, I can run this command. Oh, that won't do anything. Oh man, this is getting tiring to type all this. Oh, I'm just going to do it. So it'll probably list there's no topics. Right, there's no topics. But you can create a topic, right? So let's see if I'm not proficient with these commands, so I'm going to, there. So I can do, let's see if I can do this. Heroku, Kafka, topics, create, test, partitions, 1. I just want a single partition, just like we did locally, right? And I called my topic test. Okay. Hit enter. Oh, that's not going to work. God dang it. I need to specify an app. And the app is this. Okay, now yeah, and then right, so now we can go. Okay, what am I doing here? I can look at the list of my topics. Right, this should show that there's one topic now available. Now, one thing that's tricky about this, oh, excuse me, my nose is still running. Okay, so it created a topic called test. Now, one thing that's tricky is when you're using these the shared environments, that actually you have to, there's a prefix that you have to use when you in your code. So instead of connecting to test like we did earlier, I have to connect to powder-50196 dot then test. And again, if you look at the if you look at your config here, you can pull that out of that prefix is provided to you in an environment variable. So in our code, we would have to not connect to test, but this Kafka prefix then test. So that's just one interesting thing. Now, I think they also provide some tools to simulate, listening and pushing data to it, just like we did before. So let's see if we can find that. Okay, so there's a write, right? And then there's a tail command. So let's see if we can get this to work, actually. So what I can do is run, let's try to write a message first, and then we'll listen to it on another screen. So if I could do this right, let me get this down here. So I type in Heroku, Kafka, topics, write, test. I guess message might be just a word hello. And then I have to provide an app, and that's my app. Let's see if this actually writes. I haven't tried this before. This is equivalent to doing our, oh, it didn't fail. So let's see now, I need to do tail. So I need to do, I'm going to do another screen called Heroku, Kafka, topics, tail, which usually means read the tail end of it continuously. Test, app, paste, boom. I should see the word hello here if it's doing what I think it's doing. If not, leave it to you to research it. Well, maybe tailing it from this point forward. So let's do this. Let's send another message to it and see. Let's write another message to it. Oh, there it is. Right. So I wrote a message from one screen, and then of course here is the message now coming back. So it does actually did what we were doing earlier with the local environment. Okay. Let's try to think what else. Okay, to be honest, what we're going to do here is I'm not going to try to run this code, the local code in Heroku, mostly because in order to get this to work, let me just I'll show you sort of generally what we'd have to do. So no Kafka is the library we're using, and under connections, they do support SSL. So there's a concept of SSL here. And if you look carefully, they do support connection strings that have more than one entry. It's somewhere buried in here. So it looks like we could use our environment variable for the Kafka URL just as a connection string, right? But then we also need to supply this, and this is where the cert's going to come in. If you look carefully, you'll see there's a cert and a key option here. Actually, you can provide it like right here, right? And you look carefully, there is a Kafka client cert here and key here. So it looks like you'll be able to just, it shouldn't be that hard to do, but I just don't want to get bogged down in it. Basically, looking at their documentation, it looks like I can basically use SSL, and this is how I provide the keys when I set up my producer or my consumer for that matter. Okay, so I'm going to end the video with this. Just knowing conceptually how Kafka works and conceptually how I would get this to run under Heroku, and then we'll just move to another topic though, because this is kind of at the edge of our area of study.